Welcome to video lesson number 9 in module 215, Advanced Behavior Management and Programming. Up until this point in the course, we spent most of our energy looking at pervasive behavioral approaches that will gradually improve the behavior of the people we're supporting, making it more functional for them and usually more functional for everybody else. For the next few videos, we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk about some of the more common behavioral challenges that you'll experience in the workplace. We'll understand why they exist and start talking about some of the tools, many of which we've been talking about, but we'll bring to bear in a more organized and specific fashion to help you understand how to address these common behaviors. These behavior problems are often referred to as target behaviors or troublesome behaviors. I prefer the word troublesome strictly because it's less confusing than target. You'll occasionally run into people that talk about target behavior, referring to the behavior we're trying to create. So we're going to use the terms troublesome to talk about the behavior we want to not have, and desired behavior to talk about the behavior we're looking for. And we'll sometimes abbreviate that to TB and DB. One of the things that people often think when they go into the field is that they're going to see lots of physical violence or lots of strange sexual behaviors. And those are not even close to the most common behavioral problems you'll experience. Certainly they sometimes occur. But by far the most common behavioral problems that you'll see will be power struggles and behaviors that are associated with getting attention that may be socially unusual, inappropriate, or dysfunctional. These behaviors can include things like socially aggressive behaviors. Now again, I'm not talking about physical aggression. I'm talking about people that don't quite know how to get other people to listen to them. Maybe they grab clothing or tap your shoulder for too long. Maybe they step into your personal space, ask questions that are too personal, or put their face right up to you. Maybe they hug people who don't want to be hugged, or hug the wrong people like strangers. Sometimes we see behaviors called perseveration, and that tapping behavior I mentioned earlier would be an example of this. When a person perseverates, they do a behavior, even though it's not getting a response, for an extended period of time. The most common version of this is people asking the same questions repeatedly over and over and over again. And they're not always questions in the form of a demand. Those are pretty easy to understand. When a person continuously asks, "Are we there yet?" or "Can I have a cookie?" you can tell that they want to get there or that they want a cookie. But sometimes these forms of perseveration are much more subtle. People telling the same story over and over again, or asking you if it's your birthday, are a couple of examples. Another behavior in this class is the behavior of simply non-responding. That person, when asked to do something or spoken to, seems to not even recognize that something was said to them, or almost acts as though they weren't heard. This almost always causes the staff person to repeat themselves, or to repeat themselves and get louder, but the non-responsive individual literally does nothing in response. And it's usually a way of a person indicating that they simply don't want to do what's being asked of them. Sometimes people are more actively non-compliant. They might walk away or verbally refuse to do something. You might hear people refer to this as passive-aggressive behavior. I'm not a big fan of this term as much anymore because, first of all, it assumes a type of motivation, and it suggests that people are trying to hurt us by being passive when we want them to do something. It's not completely inaccurate, but I think it isn't as good a description as simply saying a person is non-compliant or non-responsive. Remember, there are times when you're non-responsive to people or non-compliant to people, and you're being completely reasonable. The next class of behaviors in this area is the socially disruptive behaviors area. Sometimes people refer to these as tantrums, and once again, I'm not a big fan of that term because the word tantrums are really associated with little children, not a very dignified terminology. So instead, you might hear people refer to behavioral episodes or acting out. And what they're talking about is people who are being apparently intentionally disruptive in public spaces, yelling, kicking their feet, slamming objects, that sort of thing. And you might also see people do behaviors that I like to refer to as shockers. These are behaviors that this individual seems to understand break a social rule, but that they don't seem to care very much about the social rule in. For example, I worked with people who would lift their top up in public because they didn't care very much whether people saw their body, but they could see that they got a strong reaction almost every time. In a previous video, I referred to somebody who would put their finger into their nostril and then immediately pointed at somebody else, and that would always get a strong response. People would step back or scold or do something very similar. I've seen people put garbage in their mouth as a third example. So we're so used to a certain social standard that when some people break these rules, it gets an almost automatic reaction from others in the community, and there's a big payoff for some people in that. The next class of behaviors are often referred to as revenge-motivated behaviors. These behaviors occur when a person feels hurt and therefore wants to hurt back people that they perceive as having caused their hurt. These behaviors can look like stealing. It's not always easy to tell whether a person is stealing. I prefer to literally call it taking without asking or taking without paying, because sometimes people are doing that simply without knowing that there's a social rule. I worked with an individual who just simply walked out of a record store with some of the music that he wanted because he didn't understand that it was supposed to be paid for. So sometimes people know what they're doing, and we might call it stealing. In other cases, people simply took something without knowing that they were supposed to pay for it or ask for it. Reporting on other people, sometimes we refer to this as tattling, is another example of a behavior in this category. And in particular, we're concerned about people who do false tattling, who make up stories or exaggerate stories to try and get people that they perceive as being in power in trouble. That could mean staff or roommates or other students, just as a few examples. Name-calling and insulting behaviors also fit into this category. They're often evidence that a person is hurting and wants to hurt others back in turn. Acting out behavior we've talked about earlier, but I'm going to expand on it a little bit. Acting out behavior can include verbal behaviors. Again, the term tantrums is not very popular anymore, but it can look like people being very vocal and loud in a public place, yelling and screaming, but also threatening. And sometimes people can use physical activity to do this, whether it's gestures, damaging property such as smashing things, or even self-injurious behaviors such as biting themselves or hitting themselves. It's important to know the distinction between self-injurious behaviors, which are typically done in public and are typically done when a person's emotionally aroused, and self-mutilation, which is a different subject entirely. In these types of behaviors, self-mutilation, people usually do them in a more hidden way, often concealing what they've done with their clothing. They're often smaller things like pulling out hair or making small incisions on the skin. And we think that that is being done to help the person release endorphins. It's almost like a form of taking a drug or self-medicating. So when I talk about self-injury, I'm talking about behavior that is more prominent and obvious and not self-mutilation. But let's continue. Aggression in this case can also refer to people attempting or actually physically acting violently to others, so hitting, kicking, and biting. This can happen in two ways. Sometimes it's incidental. And what we mean by incidental aggression is that you might have happened to be close to or in the path of a person who is agitated and trying to get away. So maybe you got pushed or bumped or slapped. But sometimes people, and this is more rare, sometimes people have more targeted aggression, where they'll go and look for the person that they think has caused them an issue, or they'll go looking for somebody to create, to do something to. It might even be a stranger. They'll intentionally approach somebody with the intention of causing injury. And when this happens, even if you get out of the way, the person may continue to pursue you. Avoidance is the last one we want to talk about. Behaviors in this class can include people who pretend that they're sick or pretend that they're tired because they know that at least some of the time gets them excused from things that they don't feel confident in doing. And sometimes people simply are lethargic in general. And what this means is that they seem to have no interest in just about anything. And this is particularly common in people who have major depressive disorder or dysthymia, or even people who have been in a medical facility or in treatment for quite some time. Getting back on their feet and getting back into an active schedule can be really challenging for folks. So sometimes people are just simply difficult to motivate in general. So those are the common classes of behavior that you'll see, and some of the more common behavioral, some of the common behaviors specifically that you'll see in those classes. So what do we do? Well, we're going to start by talking about the really basic approach. And this approach will apply to every single behavior problem you ever experience as you're working in whatever sector of the field you end up in. The first step is always to assess. And in particular, we mean functionally assess. Try to understand the need that is being met by the behavior. Behavior is always, always, always an indication of a need. Even if the person doesn't mean to tell you what they're needing, it is still an indication of a need. And if we step back and do a careful assessment, most of the time we can either figure it out or get a pretty good idea. And then through further assessment, we'll get closer and closer to understanding what is going on. So we have a whole module on assessment in the first semester, and I certainly won't be reiterating all of it here. But functional assessment involves taking a look at the person's medical needs, particularly if we think there might be some medical explanation for their behavior. It also includes taking a look at their behavior in the past and talking to people who've known them and worked with them for some time, including their own family and other staff. It includes organized ways of observing and recording data for people. You'll learn more about those in a subsequent class, but it's certainly very important for everybody on the staff team to have a degree of rigor about collecting that information and recording it accurately so that you get a real picture of what might be going on. And of course, interviewing the person, or at the very least, asking them and observing what they're doing as a sense of why they might be experiencing something is not only an ethical but highly effective thing to do most of the time. Whatever conclusions you end up reaching through your assessment process, one of the most important things for us to do, and it might seem obvious, but one of the most difficult things often for people to do, is to actually accept that the person's needs are real. In many cases, I've sat with staff people and they just couldn't do this. For example, I've said something like, well, I think Johnny needs a lot of attention. And staff people have said, well, Johnny gets tons of attention. I don't think that's it. But you have to remember something. People have different amounts of need in their life. You might like chocolate while the person sitting next to you might love chocolate and consider it an essential ingredient. You might like being alone more than somebody else in your household. So everybody's needs are different, but they're all equally legitimate. Using our own needs as some kind of evidence that the person should have their needs met is judgmental and it's not client-centered. So once we accept that the need or needs are actual and real, our work becomes about helping the person to find a way that gets them more of what they need. In other words, we want to give them a new behavior or behaviors that are more functional for them, that get them what they want more often, more consistently, more quickly, gets them more of what they want, more valued reward, and all of that stuff together is going to be even more effective. We learned that from the functional continuum way, way back at the beginning of the module. Sometimes, though, people have such deeply entrenched patterns of troublesome behavior that it's not just enough to focus on the desired behavior or focus on the rewards. Sometimes people do need some consequentiation for the behavior that we're trying to get rid of or to reduce. And when we do that, it's really important to understand that we always continue to focus on the reinforcement end of the spectrum. When we have consequences, we don't put all our energy into the consequences, we put our energy into the rewards. And secondly, when we apply those consequences, we must do them in an ethical way, meaning we use logical consequences or safe and approved, natural consequences. Again, there are many instances where I've created programs that had simply no consequences. That's quite acceptable. But the opposite is not acceptable. One should never create a program that is entirely focused on the consequence side of things. If you create a program that has bad things happen when people do the wrong behaviors, but nothing good happens when they do the right behaviors, then your behavioral program will not only fail, but it will actually cause the behavior to worse, and the therapeutic relationship will suffer a great deal. The vast majority of behavioral problems you will witness are rooted in a person's need for attention or power or both. They are incredibly common needs, more common in the work you'll do than the needs of physiology, such as food or rest, or pain management. And if we deal with them effectively, they're going to be much more common than behavior that reflects anger or low self-esteem. So why? That's what I'd like you to do in the blog. I'd like you to take a moment and think about why it might be so common for the people that we support to have high or unmet needs in this area of attention and power. Take a moment to record those and come back to the next video, which will begin with some answers.